And joining us for more on today's developments are Congressman Raul Grijalva, a Democrat who represents Arizona's 7th District, which shares a 300-mile border with Mexico, and Michael Hethmon, General Counsel for the Immigration Law Reform Institute. He helped write the Arizona bill. Mr. Hethmon, you worked with the people in Arizona. Why did they feel this law was necessary?
Well, this is the accumulation of an effort by Senator Pierce and other legislators since 2004 to deal with the federal government's failure to develop a viable, sustainable immigration policy, which means control of illegal immigration and the reduction of legal immigration to sustainable levels. They are tired of waiting and believe that the crisis has reached a point in Arizona that they had no choice but to continue in the direction that they've been going.
Congressman, I want to go into the merits, but first, what about this argument that the absence of federal action sort of gave Arizona a place to, a need to go ahead with something?
I would generally agree with that, but the absence of federal action, it's kind of ironic that Senator Pierce, the father of this legislation, has opposed any federal initiative, whether it's the Strive Act, whether it is the DREAM Act, whether it is Ag Jobs Bill, any path to legalization has been opposed. So, you know, it's a convenient excuse to say we want to control immigration and we want to limit immigration, and at the same time provide no reasonable, rational approach to it. I think this legislation is a harbinger for very bad things.
Well,
it's going to fundamentally be found unconstitutional. And when you talk about profiling, I thought the governor's effort of the executive order was kind of interesting. Russell Pierce will be driving down the street without his wallet. A policeman will stop him, pat him on the hand, and send him home. I will be driving down the street without a wallet, and I stand the chance of getting arrested, put in jail, and fined $500. That is where the profiling will happen, and that's the discriminatory aspect that has got so many of us in Arizona completely opposed to this bill, just on the punitive nature of it and isolating a group of people because of who they are, as opposed to applying the law equally to everyone.
I should say we're referring to Russell Pierce as the state senator in Arizona, who was largely one of the main backers here. So, Mr. Hethmon, on that issue, the profiling issue that has galvanized so much of the controversy here, the language is a reasonable suspicion for an officer to feel that he or she should check on the immigration status. Why is that okay as a legal standard?
Well, actually, the standard in the Arizona bill, reasonable suspicion that a person is unlawfully in the country, is much more modest than the federal standard established by the Supreme Court, which says that an officer in a lawful stop does not need any reasonable suspicion at all to query the person about their immigration status. So what we're seeing in Arizona is a much more modest measure, which is designed to be practical and to deal with these kind of wild claims that Mr. Grijalva is making.
Well, but as a practical matter, as the congressman says, if Mr. Pierce is sitting there, and
as a practical matter, if Representative Grijalva is pulled over for driving through a red light and the officer stops him and says, "Sir, what's your immigration status?" and Mr. Grijalva says, "I'm a United States citizen and proud of it," that's the end of the inquiry in this situation, unless the officer has a reasonable suspicion that Mr. Grijalva is making a false claim to U.S. citizens. So U.S. citizens and legal residents are very well protected in this bill. A lot of thought has gone into what happens in that scenario.
Well, and Congressman, we heard your governor today said that there would be more training for law enforcement people just to make sure that there are no abuses here.
Well, that's going to be the crux of the legal challenge. Not only the racial profiling, and I think the president is correct. It's misguided, and it needs to look. We need to investigate what its effect on civil rights is going to be. And on this profiling issue, the fact that the governor has to do an executive order to set up a training program for officers to make sure there are no basic fundamental constitutional violations and violation of the anti-profiling federal law begs the question about whether this is reasonable and moderate, as the gentleman just said.
Mr. Hethmon, we saw the governor said today, actually, that the eyes of the nation are watching Arizona. Is she right? Are there other efforts, or would you be intending to push this approach in other states?
There have been over 1,000 immigration-related measures, according to the National Council of State Legislatures, introduced just this year in the 2010 session. There were 1,500 estimated in 2009, 1,500 in 2008. This is not something that came out of a vacuum. The senator has been working on this with the citizens of the state since the passage of Prop 200 in 2004. Every time this issue has been put to the electorate down there, it has passed by majorities in the 60s to 70%. This is clearly the will and the intention of the voters in that state, and it is something that has been developed in legal terms in an incremental fashion over the past 5 or 6 years. Well, the courts have upheld it.
And Congressman, that was the fear that you heard President Obama talk about today, that other states would begin to take action.
I couldn't agree more with that fear, but, you know, the majority rule, and I understand that. I understand that concept, and that's the concept of democracy. But there is also the protection of the minority that is part and parcel of our rule of law in this country. And this bill, 1070, completely violates that protection of the minority. And I would suggest that we're talking about not just a legal issue here in Arizona. We've had many dark shadows over the state. Politically speaking, and this is not only the most recent one, but probably the one with the most effect on the nationalization of this issue. And it has to be nationalized. It's a federal law, and a federal law is what needs to be reformed in this country, and allowing, you know, what if Russell Pierce tomorrow morning decided that, you know, the Voting Rights Act is not something he likes, and maybe some people shouldn't vote. He gets the legislature to vote for it, gets the governor to sign it, and now what? We are now going to have that as the rule of the state superseding the federal law? I don't think so.
Well,
I think that's going to be the constitutional challenge that has to occur.
Congressman, just briefly, do you think this will give a big push toward a new national policy?
I hope it adds urgency to it, and I hope it adds a push. Unfortunately, members of Congress tend to run away from the issue of immigration because they're afraid of it, or they tend to exploit it because it helps them politically, as we've seen in Arizona. It's time for a little bit of spine and a lot of will to reform this law in a humane, secure, and legal manner, unlike what is happening in Arizona right now.
What do you think, Mr. Hethmon, about the prospects for this affecting the national debate, national policy?
That was the intention of the legislators, I believe, when they enacted this process from the very beginning. The only difference I would have with Representative Grijalva is somehow the idea that passing an amnesty bill is going to be the solution. We have 200, 300 million people worldwide that want to come to this country. Amnesty won't work. If they pass an amnesty bill, if he gets everything he wants, 18 months later we're going to be back in the same situation, just like 1986.
All right, we will see what happens. Michael Hethmon and Congressman. I'm sorry, Congressman.
The law needs to be reformed, and using boogeyman buzzwords like amnesty for all, open borders, that's been the cachet for for anybody who doesn't want immigration. It's time to deal with it rationally and realistically.
Okay, thank you. We will have to leave it there. Congressman Grijalva and Michael Hethmon, thank you both very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.